I too would like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting here today on the land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their leaders, past, present and emerging. I recognise that this has always been a place of reflection on the legacy of elders and trailblazers. And I'd also like to thank the Murray Smith family for the honour of speaking here tonight. Now, I want to start by saying that I was not born an Australian woman. Before you go taking a closer look, let me explain. In 1975, when Anne Summers' groundbreaking work of feminist history, Damn Whores and God's Police, was first published, I was 6 years old. I had migrated to my new home in Australia from my native United States a year earlier. Now going to school in suburban Melbourne, this is what I knew. At Monday morning assembly, I had to sing a national anthem that I didn't know the words to, about God saving a queen. In my secular Jewish American Australian Republican household, the only God I knew was called Gough, and he didn't seem very fond of queens at all. So at assembly, I would mumble senselessly until the singing was finished and I could get on with the business of honouring the flag, serving that queen, and cheerfully obeying my parents, teachers and the law. I also knew that none of this deference and conformity was making me particularly cheerful, as my classmates teased me mercilessly for my thick American accent. They called me Bewitched, so named for the American television show whose reruns we devoured after school, in which an adorable little blonde girl called Tabitha rubbed her nose with her finger, thus making magical things happen. I was neither blonde nor adorable, and the irony was not lost on me. I wished for nothing more than to make myself disappear, but was impotent to change my fortune. The most popular girls in the class seemed to take the greatest delight in descending as a pack, wiggling their upturned suburban noses and shouting, "Bewitched!" before running away in fits of giggles. And I knew without doubt that my misery would only be compounded if I expected a teacher to return the favour of my obedience and come to my rescue. It was 1975, and the quotidian happiness of children did not count for much in the public reckoning of individual or national well-being. I first read Damn Whores and God's Police in 1990, when I was a second-year history major at Melbourne University. When I saw its title on the reading list of my Changing Notions of Women's Place course, I had no idea that this chunky purple book, with its cover image of a self-satisfied, busty wench and her suspicious prim overseer, was going to be my elusive magic wand, the intellectual tool that would finally transform my life. I was now 21 years old, and this is what I knew. I lived in a student share house with 3 smart, talented and gregarious women, an actor, an artist and an opera singer, with whom I was not, under any circumstances, allowed to share clothes. Our love lives were open slather, but our wardrobes were out of bounds. Dresses, shoes, makeup, all remained private property. No matter how much I opined that an ethic of collectivism around material possessions was the antidote to consumer capitalism, or at least our meagre budgets, my pleas fell on deaf ears. When I questioned the non-negotiable rules, I was accused of being a troublemaker. The sisterly solidarity I hoped to find and nurture in our household was dashed, along with my rosy visions of 70s-style communalism. The accusation of making mischief was especially galling, compounding the old schoolyard taunts of witchcraft. But I felt powerless to articulate the injustice much less address it. Until that fateful day in the Baillieu Library when I came across this passage in Damn Whores and God's Police. Women are not compensated with the kind of camaraderie which exists between men. Women learn not to really like each other, for this would threaten both their dependence on men and the status men derive from this, and their ability and willingness to nurture men. This basic model of submission, dependence, and hostility between women, which leads to their social isolation from each other, is reflected in and reinforced by marriage and its supporting institutions. For a few moments, time stood still. I stared out of the library windows at the manicured plane trees and neat elms of the university campus, and I contemplated the subtitle of this beguiling book, The Colonisation of Women in Australia. Could women, like landscapes, be cultivated? Could their behaviours be accultured? Could their inimical relationships with each other be grafted on, rather than indigenous to their sex? Suddenly, urgently, I knew what I had to do. I ran straight to the basement photocopies and Xeroxed pages of the purple book. I underlined important phrases on the copies, passages such as this one. The effect of this division on women themselves is to create anxiety and uncertainty, and to engender a competitive and unfriendly rivalry towards other women. And this. To identify with feminism takes considerable courage, for in doing so, women almost inevitably incur the displeasure of the men they live and work with, and risk being relegated to the damn whore stereotype themselves. And then I bolted home and put the marked up copies on the desk of the housemate who I considered the most in need of evangelising. Of course, if I was naive to get to 21 without understanding that sex is socialised, I was even more of an idiot to think my housemate would pick the photocopies up off her desk, sit down on her bed to read them, then rush out to embrace me in our mutual feminist enlightenment. She quite rightly told me not to come into her room again without permission, and we never mentioned the F word again. But Anne Summers' notion of a colonised sex filled me with hope. Not only did it help me grasp that the problem was not with me, my inability to fit in, my bothersome idealism, my persistent marginality, but the true conundrum offered its own intrinsic solution. No matter with what seeming ease the colonial invasion is accomplished, Summers argued, there is inevitably, invariably, some resistance. To me, this meant that although I might have missed the king tide of women's liberation in the 70s, I could still participate in the ebb and flow of opposition to the forces of cultural coercion. More than that, Summers insisted that the description of women being colonised was not merely metaphorical, but assumed the status of political analysis. The processes of colonisation are also culturally specific and historically rooted, and therefore, 40 years on from the publication of Damn Whores and God's Police, there are fair chunks of the book that seem dated. For my generation, for example, the antipathy towards marriage is one of these examples. Many of us were raised in non-monogamous, post-hippie homes, and few of us wanted to replicate the fallout. It would certainly be a long time before I came to understand how the annexation of sexual sovereignty affected Indigenous and gay women in ways similar and so very different from my own outlier experience. But the power of that central idea has guided my intellectual life in ways that I am only just starting to fully grasp. For all the myriad depressing ways that Summer's political, if not empirical analysis is still spot on, it is the simple energy and muscle of the idea of resistance that makes me an optimist. This lecture is therefore somewhat of a meditation on how, if I didn't start life as one, I grew up to be an Australian woman. A girl child reared on national bedtime stories whose female protagonists were either versions of slutty convicts or parodies of blue stocking teetotalers. A girl child schooled in classrooms where both the epic monumental feats of nation building and heroic acts of anti-authoritarian defiance were performed by men. A girl child acclimatised to a national ethos in which the values of collectivism, unity, independence and agency were gendered male. Our childhood databanks of personal, community and national histories give us all the information we need to construct our narratives of belonging. But as the historian Anna Clark asks, what is the impact of the histories we don't know? As it happened, I didn't only grow up to be an Australian woman, but also a woman professionally invested in the history of Australian women. And I realise now, in having this opportunity to reflect, that my research and writing to date have in one way or another grappled with the notion of female mateship. Not friendship, which I think is different, but mateship, which is ultimately a political construct because of its use as a trope in nationalist narratives and agendas. Is mateship a concept that by its very nature is exclusive of women, predicated on the absence or vilification of women? Or can it be more expansive? Has it been more expansive? In one way or another, my work has asked what female narratives of belonging might look like, and whether our nation's narratives of belonging can be gendered female. It was a line from Damn Whores that led me to my first crack at addressing these questions. Summers asked, when the socially valued areas of our culture are either occupied by men or depend for survival on values which are associated with the male sex role, what and where is women's place? What alternatives do most women have but to subsume themselves within that permitted territory and strive for self-realisation at the lower levels? As an example of such bottom feeding, Summers gave the icon par excellence of Australian women's cultural oppression. Women sitting in cars outside pubs, sipping beers brought to them by agreeable but absent husbands. So for my history honours thesis, later doctorate and book Beyond the Ladies' Lounge, I raced headlong into that bastion of male supremacy, the pub. At first, I thought my iconoclasm, writing about pub culture from a female perspective, would empirically verify and document the Australian hotel as one of those socially valued places occupied by men to the detriment of women. It is no contrivance to say that 1,000 pieces of lemon slice entirely turned my thinking around. Oral history interviews with women who had drunk, worked in, grew up in or run hotels revealed another story. As I write in the introduction to Beyond the Ladies' Lounge, my respondents told me things I didn't know. They told me stories I'd never heard. They talked about their lives in ways I'd never imagined. They introduced me to theories of work and play and politics and identity that could not be ignored or repressed or denied. These women loved pubs. The themes that emerged from my hours of cups of tea and slices of lemon slice in the ladies' lounge, remarkably no beer, though I was pregnant at the time, the themes were empowerment, pleasure, community and connection. As Kath Beyer, who had seen 3 generations of patrons come through the door of her Notting Hill hotel in outer eastern Melbourne, told me, "A woman can get more respect in a pub than on the street." Kath gave me some other inside knowledge. It was the publican who made the rules and set the tone for her establishment. Kath didn't know if there was ever a law that prohibited women from being served in the public bar. "We wouldn't have taken any notice of such a ruling anyway," Kath told me. "We use our own discretion." Kath eventually bowed to consumer demand and put in a ladies' lounge because women wanted a space to drink and yarn away from the men they had to live and work with, a room of their own, so to speak. I also learnt that the infamous pea shellers and sock darners of the working class pubs were not apocryphal, and that at the turn of the 20th century, over 50% of Victoria's hotels were run exclusively by women. Beyond the Ladies' Lounge ultimately told a story of women as proprietors rather than the victims of appropriation. Unexpectedly, I had busted 2 myths: the pub as a male domain and the pub as a symbol of female subjugation. Apart from destabilising my conventional feminist wisdoms about male centrality and female marginality, researching Beyond the Ladies' Lounge also played havoc with the orthodox damned whores and God's police duality. This is because the female publicans, who one might expect to fall into the cultural category of whore due to the notional association of women, alcohol and sexual availability, in fact turned out to be the police. Customers called them Ma and the Reverend Mother, and female publicans prided themselves on their decorum, respectability and self-control. In my next major project, I once again danced around the boundaries of the Madonna and whore dichotomy, this time quite literally. In 2007, I first pitched a documentary idea to the ABC. Sick of watching our national broadcaster churn out endless programming about male legends, politicians, soldiers, cricketers, explorers, horses, I wanted to offer up an Australian story that was about women's nation-building achievements. 5 years later, Utopia Girls went to air. Covering 6 decades and 5 main characters, Caroline Dexter, Henrietta Dugdale, Mary Lee, Louisa Lawson and Vida Goldstein, it documents how Australia became the first nation on earth to give white women full political equality, both the right to vote and to stand for Parliament. Utopia Girls was nominated for several media awards, but it wasn't a huge ratings success, something we attributed to the fact that the network scheduled it against a football match, leading one of my friends to quip, "Women might have the vote, but they still haven't got the remote." But I wanted to share with you the way I started that initial pitch to the ABC. I'm not sure whether, you can see it written up there. Which one of these women looks like a rebel to you? Which of these women are shaking the foundations of society to the core? They say the most successful revolutions are the ones we don't even notice, the ones where the reforms and schisms are so complete that we take them for granted as simply a fact of life, natural. The ones where nobody gets hurt, nobody puts their life on the line, no sacrifices are made. This is the bloodless revolution, the silent coup. Don't let the neck-to-toe dresses, pursed lips and big hats fool you. The women who led this tsunami of change were rebels with a dead serious cause. They took a sledgehammer to the legal apparatus and social custom that had oppressed, excluded and victimised their sex for centuries. Across a wide brown land and 2 idealistic generations, together they rocked the world. For those academics in the audience, you can see how a television pitch differs from an ARC grant application. So Madonna and the Pussycat Dolls didn't end up in the final program, if for no other reason than the ABC could never afford the copyright. But I think that messing with the stereotypes did jolt the TV execs out of some sort of primal quiescence about women's history. The truism in the entertainment industry is that no one wants to watch telly about women. Obviously, we are happy to look at women, but we don't want to know anything about them, and certainly not their sepia-toned, fleshless history. It also pained me to learn that apparently audiences want to see stories about winners, and somehow women have been pegged as history's losers. It was once I began to understand this insane logic that I found the hook that the networks and financing agencies could finally hang their hats on. This was a triumphal nationalist narrative, a story of Australian success on the international stage. We were the first. It didn't matter that militaristic metaphors and competitive spirit didn't drive the suffragists. At the turn of the 20th century, there was, of course, a genuine spirit of international cooperation and multilateral effort to pursue women's suffrage as the most impotent of emancipatory tools. But what matters is that Australia won the race and held line honours in democratic practice. It was like a political Ashes series, with Mother England getting done. With such insipid intellectual fuel in the tank, why did I even bother? After I had my own daughter in 2005, coming on the heels of two sons, I became psychically fixated on the notion of role models. By the look in my little girl's eye, I knew I had just become one, in a way I had never been to my boys, who loved me but knew they were not me. When my daughter was 3, she put words to that look in her eye. "Mummy," she said, "I love you because I am you." There were ramifications to this new pedestal I'd been involuntarily placed upon, and frankly, the professional remedies were easier to deal with than the psychological ones. I decided that, as a feminist historian, it was my responsibility to offer up role models from the past who could show our sons and daughters that change, real game-changing change, only comes from action. Forget the faux liberation of raunch culture and The Bachelor. We need feminist history just as much now as we needed it in the 1970s. This is just a funny thing that happens when you put up Utopia Girls in Google Images. Apparently, there are 2 things that bear the title Utopia Girls: my documentary and a strip club in California. Sexual inequality still lies at the dark heart of domestic violence, cyberbullying, and online pornography, not to mention our political culture, corporate structures, and wage and industrial hierarchies. There is still so much to do. But how can we know what we are capable of doing, achieving, experiencing, if we don't understand how women before us have lived their lives, the obstacles they endured and overcame? Viewing one's own actions in an historical vacuum leads to a very modern form of competitive performance anxiety, where popular culture serves up a constant diet of images of glamorous, self-assured women divorced from any interpretation of how they got to be on society's pedestal. The image is redolent of result rather than process, individual success, not collective struggle. To me, Utopia Girls is about understanding the nature of historical legacies and our inheritance as both women and Australians. Our activist foremothers resisted the expectations of their times to be inert, to breed, to know their place, and eventually mobilised enough women and male champions of change to make the structural transformations that would see Australia, as our federal Senate noted in 1910, become the first nation to make justice the foundation of its constitution. But we all know that this early achievement is not the end of the story. Indeed, for Indigenous Australians, it wasn't even a true story. I'm thrilled to say that Utopia Girls has been broadcast on the ABC 5 times since its first screening, is now widely studied in schools, and is on the new National History curriculum coming into effect in 2016. I doubt anybody who can remember who won the footy that night that it was first shown. The last stop on this little cook's tour of what I have inherited personally and professionally from my feminist foremothers is the research project that in some way addresses most head-on one of Anne Summers' key critiques. It is notable, Summers wrote, that women have rarely participated in the writing of Australia's nationalist narratives. A likely reason for this, she posits, is that the dominant themes which have been reproduced over 3 generations with little modification, the lucky country of wealth and freedom, egalitarianism, mateship, are so patently at odds with the life experiences of almost all Australian women. Pastoral, industrial, political and mining development, she argues, are all processes which have not involved women or have engaged their energies only in a peripheral way. Just as the pub is a cornerstone of Australia's social identity, so Eureka is a seminal political foundation story. It is the so-called birthplace of Australian democracy, no less. Eureka is also a potent cultural symbol. The Eureka flag graces both the hard hats and high vis of our unionists and provides the template for the fuck you tattoos of our right-wing reclaimers. As a key nationalist narrative of belonging, Eureka gives mixed messages. But the unifying through line in the story has always been this. It is a story about male passions inflamed, male blood shed, and male rights won. In 2004, I began to test the received wisdom that the Ballarat goldfields of 1854 were, in fact, the exclusively male terrain of legend, by asking what role women might have played beyond the fabled sempstresses of the flag. My intention was not to demolish the prominence and prestige of the Eureka story in Australia's collective imagination. Beyond the Ladies' Lounge had taught me that people hold effective relationships with certain narratives for a reason, but rather to test both the masculinist and feminist received wisdoms. Was this particular nationalist narrative really so patently at odds with the life experiences of women? Was that why they weren't present in the history I'd been taught in school? Were we not teaching our children the right stories, or were we only getting part of the story? 10 years later, in The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka and its new young adult offshoot, We Are the Rebels, I was able to demonstrate that women were inextricably linked to the commercial, political and mining, as well as social and cultural development of the Ballarat diggings. They were so close to the action, indeed instigators of action, that women were even killed in the stockade. Turns out the Eureka story contains role models aplenty for any budding young female activists and change makers of today. It's a pretty fun story too. So why are women written out of history? Because, I'd suggest, so many of their stories in fact go against the grain of the dominant gender stereotypes. Pub tarts are really upright businesswomen. Buttoned-up social reformers are world-leading nation builders. Rebellious miners are chicks. And as the historian Rowan Carl has noted plainly, it is not good that ordinary folk know they can resist the unresistible. My hope is for a time when Australia shares a national identity in which valued traits and tropes, solidarity, unity, ingenuity, adaptability, risk-taking, standing up for your mates and standing together against injustice are gender neutral and socially and racially inclusive. To finish, there is a tree that I pass as I walk from the car park to my office at La Trobe University. Judging by the girth of the trunk, the tree must predate the campus by at least a century. A eucalypt, the tree is home to possums that dart in and out of its ample holes when I pass late at night. Flocks of pink and grey galahs and noisy rainbow lorikeets stake their claim in the morning. Over the decade or so that I've been at La Trobe, I've watched this poor tree be hacked away by arborists swinging on guy ropes, its limbs mulched by hungry machines. Apparently, trees are dangerous and must be nipped and tucked to keep themselves nice for humans. My chest swells with misplaced pride every time I pass this tree. For out of the gnarly old limbs, scarred and interrupted by the blade, shoot hundreds of nimble new branches. Green foliage fringes the grey bark, providing fresh haven for the birds that seek food, shelter, and it seems to me, something like joy. If the university is waiting for the tree to die so the arborists can haul her away once and for all, the tree hasn't read the same OH&S briefing. I know that it is the internet that has provided women with the latest and greatest tool for female empowerment. Online communication has given women a platform for mobilisation and an unmediated voice for recognition and reform. But if I was to find a metaphor in nature for the enduring strength and sovereignty of women, it would not be the amorphous cloud, but this one tree. In her silent way, accommodating yet stalwart, the tree symbolises resistance. Rules and fashion and bricks and mortar may come and go, but fresh growth emerges from the hoary scars. Yes, the institutions and stereotypes and power structures that seek to reduce, divide and vivisect women into manageable proportions still exist, 40 years on from the time that Anne Summers planted her great beanstalk of an idea. But, as women have always done, we continue to sprout new offshoots of old ambitions. It is the Australian story that needs to grow up. Thank you.